Okay, hello everyone. How's it going? Hope you like my haircut I've been giving myself slowly for the last 4 days. It's, I think it's finally over with. Hope you're holding up okay out there. Um, I will post the final exam questions by the end of the week. It is optional. You do not have to take the test. You can take it to replace a grade from either the essay wrote about Balzac and the film by Jacques Rivette based on the story, Unknown Masterpiece, The Beautiful Troublemaker, or to replace your grade on your short sort of imitation of Benjamin's One Way Street book. You should have received from me today an email with your grade if you gave me a paper. If you have not turned in anything to me yet, that is okay. This is not ideal, but I want you to turn stuff in, and you need to do so by May 20th. I repeat, you need to turn in your stuff to me if you want to pass by May 20th. Sorry, I'm getting a text. Okay, tonight we're going to talk about this book, Psychoanalysis, The Impossible Profession, by the great journalist and critic Janet Malcolm. And we're going to discuss her method in relation to Freud, but also what she's doing in her own right that's interesting, and what does it mean to be a critic who's also a journalist. So let's just go back and review, though, first of all, this main concept. Wait, is this too bright? Is that why this is happening? Does that help? Okay, no, it doesn't. That word at the top of the board, I bought this board, and then when I write on it, you can't see what it says. What is criticism? That's the question up there. Um, and again, I gave you like kind of the textbook classical answer to this earlier in the semester. Maybe since day one, really, we've been talking about this. The difference, the two main forms being one, evaluation, like a review essay, okay? A review of a restaurant, a review of a movie, a review of a book, a review of a play, a review of an opera, a review of a television show, etc., etc., etc. Okay, a review of a politician's performance in a debate, whatever that may be. Evaluation: is it good or bad? All right. And this is dominant. This is important. This is fun. You know, I'm sure you love, if you love going to the movies, part of what you love about it is not only the movie, but then leaving the theater and getting to opine and argue with your friends about what you liked about the movie and what you didn't like and so on, okay? And also in that conversation with your friends about the movie, I don't know if this is old fashioned. Do people even go to movies anymore? I mean, now we don't, but prior to the prior to the crisis, were people going? Um, uh, uh, Also, whatever it is you're arguing about, a television show you like, that we're watching those, right, on Netflix or HBO or whatever nowadays. You're also, when you're arguing, doing what we would call uh, criticism that's a matter of understanding, okay? That is finding meaning and offering interpretation. Okay. Now, again, just to apply this to something from last week, you could think of Freud's book, although he didn't necessarily think of it this way, but it works. I think the book Dora as a form of a work of criticism. He has a patient who who he evaluates to a surprising degree, and who he is also, more importantly, trying to understand. And his evaluation of her is that, a little bit of column A and B. He's ambivalent about her. He doesn't trust her. He doesn't like her very much, it seems. But also, man, he can't stop thinking about her. Unlike all his other patients, he wrote a whole damn book about her. Okay, so there is definitely some evaluation. There's some mistrust. There's some obsession. There's, transference from Freud to her. There's counter-transference onto her, from his past, from his relationship with his sister, or the governess who he took the name Dora from, his sister's governess when they were kids. And then, but more importantly, there's also understanding. There's criticism of an understanding, and that's seeking to offer an interpretation. And Freud's method for doing that is going through her dreams. And you don't have to buy that, but I hope you found it at least interesting and maybe even novel, what he was doing there. And he was seeking meaning in her actions. Okay, a meaning that seemed to escape her. And by meaning, I mean like what the use of our behavior. Okay, so we've looked at all kinds. Just to draw back further into this, we've looked at all kinds of different forms of criticism this semester. I hope you appreciate that. And we've looked at literature too, because this is Intro to Literary Studies, so we haven't neglected literature either, hopefully. Hopefully I've been seeing that way. But we looked at criticism of literature, written by Charles Rosen. We looked at criticism of society, written by Walter Benjamin. We looked at political criticism, written by, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and then Engels. We looked at historical and biographical criticism, written by Stephen Jay Gould. And really, you could think of the literary works we discussed and read, the short stories by Balzac, and the poem "The Giaour" by Byron. You could think of those works as works of criticism. There's a great quote from the German writer Friedrich Schlegel that Rosen uses in his essay on Benjamin, where he says, "Great works of art criticize themselves. They contain their own criticism." That is, they have a certain method and interpretation. And one argument would be that the role of the critic is to discover that about the text. But Schlegel doesn't say that. Schlegel says, since it's already there, to do that is redundant. That's superfluous. Why do that? What you need to do as a critic is not discover what's in the text, but write a work of criticism that's inspired by the text. Okay? And that's how you should think of Janet Malcolm's book. It's relatively independent of Freud. She does quote Freud here and there, but Freud is not the main figure in the text. The main figure is this sort of random, middle-of-the-road, average Joe psychoanalyst. Not some famous big shot. A guy who's, represents maybe not the extremes like Freud, the founding genius of the movement, but one of its just sort of minor, to use an analogy from basketball, role players. A guy coming off the bench in the second quarter when the game is not hanging in the balance, and you don't need to hit the final shot. Okay, um, so it's an interesting approach, but that's one way to think of her criticism. Now, I want to go on in this first video and just discuss. So the last form of criticism we're looking at. So again, if we think of all the forms of criticism we've looked at literature or literary criticism. We looked at sociological criticism in Benjamin. We've looked at political criticism. We've looked at, as I was just saying, psychological criticism in Freud. We've looked at biographical criticism in Gould, biographical and historical criticism, his writings on the history of science and on the history of reception of Darwin and of Freud. And then now, last but certainly not least, and probably the form you're most familiar with, as I've been saying since day one, a movie review, a restaurant review on Yelp and so on. This is what we call journalistic criticism, okay? So what is up with journalism? Journalism and journalistic criticism, or as it's more commonly maybe called today, not so much journalism, is dying, and newspapers are being replaced by Twitter and people communicating not on the printed page anymore, which is ambiguous, doubtful at best for me. The media, okay? The media, television is probably where you see most of the journalism. You see that's how most people get their news. And there's really, again, to do a kind of dichotomy of versus good and bad ways of thinking about journalism, there's a heroic sense, okay? If we're asking this question, what is this heroic sense of being a journalist? And that's to say, a famous cliche about journalism: journalists write the first draft of history. The first draft of history. And isn't that wonderful? And aren't they important? And Lord knows they think that about themselves. Not Malcolm, but your average journalist is pretty self-satisfied in how they think of themselves. Okay, this is true. I mean, in good and bad ways, to take a heroic sense, and I can mean heroic in the sense that the word, it becomes a deed and it has an impact on history. You would think of an example being Watergate. If you don't know, Watergate's a hotel in D.C., in the capital of the country, and there was a famous burglary there during the midst of the 1972 presidential election, where the Democratic National Committee's offices in the building were things were stolen from them. That was traced thanks to the journalism of these famous guys, Woodward and Bernstein. They're Bob Woodward and Charles Bernstein. They're both still alive. They worked at the Washington Post. They're big mucky mucks. And there's a movie about this called All the President's Men, very famous Alan Pakula film starring Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. Won a bunch of awards and so on, where it documents them. They uncovered this scandal. They uncovered the connection to Nixon's White House, and it led to the president resigning from power. Extraordinary series of events. Seems quaint today that a president would resign. Like, Trump would never resign over anything. But and again, that's a good positive thing. Also, forget Watergate. How about, forget that. Let's talk about the war in Iraq. This war that was fought on the now widely repudiated as false argument that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and was about to use them against Western countries, the United States, etc. And journalists went along with this. Famously, in the New York Times, this journalist named Judith Miller, you can look it up, she printed a lot of information that came directly from government sources, often anonymous, that turned out to be deeply misleading, if not just outright lies and false. Okay, and she was instrumental in legitimizing their argument that Iraq needed to be attacked in 2003. Okay, now so that's this heroic sense. On the other hand, what you could say about journalism that's not so great about it is summed up in an old cliche about journalism. Yesterday's news wraps today's garbage. Yesterday's news, and I know that's a little dated because we don't get our news from the newspaper anymore. But imagine the newspaper, the AM New York or the Post. You still see newspapers around New York. Yesterday's news wraps today's garbage, meaning forget that first draft of history stuff. That's rare. On average, most of the stuff that's printed is just forgotten. It's mostly noise, and very little of it is an actual signal of anything. Okay? And it's just a distraction. They don't tell us things that help us comprehend. They tell us things that titillate us, that excite us, that but in a bad way, through lurid events and details. The old expression: if it bleeds, it leads. Okay, you don't report on I don't know how the schools need money as the top story of the hour, because according to journalistic logic that's boring. You report on the fact that somebody got killed. Okay, even though that's in the grand scheme of things probably not as significant to most people's lives as the fact that the schools need money. Okay, so and again, there's all kinds of ways of thinking of this, but just to go to Malcolm for a second, Malcolm has a famous book called, and she was born in 1934. She's still alive. She's 86. We are reading a living writer. Haha. That's right. Keep it somewhat current. She is famous for kind of adhering to the latter opinion, that journalism is a somewhat, she has a kind of self-deprecating, meaning view of journalism. Like, she doesn't like her profession. She says in a famous quote, I'll get the quote here in a second, that every journalist who is not too stupid or too full of himself to notice what is going on knows that what he does is morally indefensible. Morally of her profession. And you could say this about critics too, critics. Who needs the critics? We need the artists who make the stuff. And then the critics, come along and shit on it. And they're just parasites. They're not the actual creative people. They're just latching on, all right? I don't think that about some of them, but a lot of them, it's a true statement, okay? What are they doing that's morally indefensible? Well, they're sorry, how do you spell that word? I missed the F, sorry. Okay, there we go. Morally indefensible. They pretend to objectivity when that, and it's just, and when it, that's what it is. It's a pretense. It's not a reality that they're being objective. Okay, and they frame events to fit reader, what they perceive as the reader's expectations and the desire for uh, scandal. Okay. Um, so another funny way of putting this is, I don't know if you've ever like, for example, like just think about journalists covering a celebrity's life or a celebrity's trial. You know, the average paparazzi hounding some poor celebrity. Not that I think celebrities are all victims or anything. You know, what kind of life is that? It's that's an obvious example where you can criticize them, and they're not. They're like subliterate. You know, they're just selling photos to Us Magazine and Gawker or whatever. A better example is like journalists coming to trial. Like, I don't know if you guys remember when Michael Jackson. Probably most of you are not old enough to remember, but Michael Jackson was on trial at one point in the 90s. No, in the aughts. It was in the aughts, like 2004 or five, for sexually abusing a child in California where he lived. And there was this media circus, media spectacle set up around the courthouse. You know, there were all these fans there, crazy people, nothing better to do. There were all these journalists there, kind of, you know, parasitically trying to pull information out of this grotesque trial where, you know, this talented man that many people loved is being destroyed over allegations that he abused children. And the journalists are there. They pretend to objectivity. What they're really doing is they're isn't any better than what Jackson did. They're reporting it, and they're trying to rip details out of these people who are all going through hell. Okay, and that's their job. All right. And very famously, I don't know if you guys know you can. Maybe I'll put a link to this on um, Conan O'Brien, the late night TV host. He sent his quote unquote he's a comedian. He sent his correspondent, who is a comedian who wears this sock puppet dog called Triumph the Insult Comic Dog. And Triumph went to the trial to make fun of all the fans who were there, but then of course also to definitely make fun of the journalists who were there pretending to be serious people covering this ridiculous, you know, morbid, melancholy event where this hero of America is being you know, brought low. Not something to celebrate. And he says at one point, he says to this one journalist he's interviewing, he says, "What are you doing? Or where do you get anything to eat? Anything good to eat around here?" And then when she tries to respond, he says, he's set her up, right? He's an insult comedian. He says, "Oh, who am I kidding? You guys don't eat food. You feed on human misery." And that's really a criticism that Malcolm is about, is that they're feeding on misery. Okay, that's the whole attitude of it bleeds, it leads. And when they follow that too much and don't give us enough wisdom or the right kind of information that can help us comprehend things, the signal and not the noise, then we're lost. The world's very complicated, and in this deluge of information every day, the ability to understand the world gets lost, and what could be the real role of the journalist is lost. All right, and so this is all just to say that Malcolm is an exception to this rule. Okay, she is about, unlike most, her writing has wisdom. And what is the wisdom? Ultimately, what's her method? Her method is very similar. Her father was a psychiatrist to Freud's. What does Freud do with his patients? He listens. Okay? She listens and reports. or tries anyway. All right, and she got herself in some hot water a few times. But anyways, that's sort of a, a brief rambling introduction to her. I'm going to come back and we'll talk through the beginning of the book and a couple other passages in two other videos. Okay, I'll be back at you in a moment.